I agree that the core issue is a cultural one. And to me, it seems like on the one side, the people who are against psychedelics, it's a psychology of fear and control, it seems to me. And ironically, perhaps the solution to that is psychedelic medicine. So the people who are kind of, I think maybe it's not a coincidence, the people who want to suppress it are the people who probably don't want to go anywhere near it themselves because they're afraid to face their own shadow material and actually engage in this process. And maybe that's why, the legitimacy of psychedelics making their way through the kind of clinical system hopefully will give us some foothold of legitimacy in that world. Do you think psychedelics could be the thing that changes the mind of people who are against psychedelics?
If psychedelics could change the mind of people of those who are against psychedelics,
Yeah.
well, I guess that's a kind of problem of the egg and the chicken, right? Like, well, if only they were not against psychedelics and could try psychedelics, then
Right.
uh, I think, as you said, you mentioned fear and control. Yeah, that's true. And I think, but still it's like a kind of psychological explanation. People being afraid or wanting to control
Right.
things and not lose control. I think it's even more than that. I think it's that, but it's not just that. It's like there is somewhere in our, moral codes and our cultural imprint that we are trained and teach to think that these things are not right. And sometimes when it's right, it's kind of funny or kind of childish or kind of a bit, naughty to talk about it. So those are the foundations, the moral foundations of prohibitionism. The idea that you shouldn't ingest anything, that you can't alter your body, that these things are external or artificials, or that they are creating just a feeling of empathy or vision or insight, but in fact it's just like a kind of trick or even just a real mistake or perversion and all of that. And I think at the core of that is really not understanding the role of the substances that have played in different cultures. And if you look to indigenous practices and the story of psychedelics and the deep, long history, these substances have been used as part of culture, actually as a central way to transmit culture from one generation to another. In many indigenous settings, if you look at the history of how the substances appeared, it's frequently intertwined with the history of how mankind appeared on Earth as well. So the myths of origin that tell us how man came to be, why we are alive and why do we exist, why we are human, are frequently kind of intermixed with the story of these substances. So they are central to humanity and they are related to multiple spheres of life. They can be related to obviously religiosity, but also to healing, to all kinds of artistic expressions or things like divination or hunting or even warfare, to celebration, to socialization. So they are central part of society and central part of culture. And using those plants is not something of counterculture, or if you are rebellious, or if you want to go against culture, if you want to be different. But it's a lot, it has a central role in different civilizations. And it's also, used for children, of course, on different doses and with different modalities. But as you grow up to be older and to understand things, you delve deeper into these practices and participate together with the elders and learn how to be a good member of your community and how to be a part of this interchange, this connection between men, different human beings, but not just between human beings, but also human beings and and nature and the invisible world. So the relationship to non-humans, to the world of spirits, to the invisible world, to the world of ancestors, to the world beyond. So practicing these traditions is central to culture, is part of culture. It is how also culture moves around and is exchanged. And we have our kind of own versions of that. Of course, it's not the same, but what we're trying to show is that these things are part of culture. They're not anomalies or mistakens or perversions. And that's what I'm calling cultural legitimacy. And that's also why the work we're doing is kind of hard, because it's different if you say, to a potential donor or funder, I'm going to create 100 treatments for American veterans with PTSD. It's something very tangible. It's very concrete. It's a deliverable. But I'm going to work to create knowledge to help people rewrite the narrative that, drugs have a kind of demoniac, perverted origin. And I'm going to produce articles and conferences and events and gatherings, and I'm going to help advance an ethos and a sensitivity that these things are part of culture, that they have a legitimate existence, and they shouldn't be combated as such. So that's part of the challenge. And in general, biomedicine, that's not related to drugs only, but to everything. Biomedicine has more status and is kind of on the top of the scale compared to social sciences, which are considered, not real sciences, not serious or not objective enough. I can say that to a neuroscientist that probably appears to have a lot of interest in humanities. Thanks for having me, by the way, and for listening to anthropologists and not just wanting to figure neuroscientists in your show. I think having a small nonprofit, grassroots nonprofit that is led by a Ph.D. in anthropology and is talking about this freaky things about sacred plants, indigenous people, tradition, ceremony, ritual, and also how we have to include everybody in the psychedelic renaissance. It's been a challenge, but at the same time, people love it. I feel there is a real hunger. There is such a hunger out there. It's a sea full of hungry fish that are circulating around us. We get so many requests per day, interviews, media, documentaries, PhD students, volunteers, people that want healing, people that are curious, people that are journalists, people that all kinds of needs. Because understanding, talking, and having critical thinking and making reflections and having a philosophical mind is also a human need, right? We need to feed, we need to heal our bodies, but we also need food for the thought and the soul. And the work we do, I think, mixes a lot of those things, because people are looking for community, for places to exchange ideas around these topics. So in the current, with all this explosion in interest in psychedelics, I feel that the Chacruna Institute has become a kind of hub for the psychedelic community to also vent, exchange, and be a support to each other and kind of help preserve the values and the foundations of this movement, because it's changing a lot.
Right. Yeah, and I completely agree that understanding culture is one of the most important aspects of what's going on in this field. And you mentioned that we're still in a time where there's this feeling that in the mainstream that psychedelics are immoral, or it's based in a tradition of thinking of them as kind of sinful, or, as you say, not legitimate. And to me, it seems like, I think people dogmatically say that kind of thing when they don't really have a good argument. When they don't really have a good argument, the evidence doesn't suggest that psychedelics are bad in any way, if used responsibly. So you have to just kind of say they're immoral, they're, just don't go near them. And I think the solution to that, as you say, is a cultural change. And as someone who's not in the humanities, I struggle. I want to see a cultural change, and I'm not really sure what levers we can pull to make that happen. Do you think communication is the main way we can get there, through doing what you're doing in terms of, as you say, just speaking about this stuff, writing about it, doing conferences? Is that the best mechanism you think we have?
Well, like everything, there's just not like one single action that we have to take. It's totally like multifactorial. It's like when an airplane falls, frequently they have those charts. It's like series of things that happened that caused that. So how can we produce change? I think it's not just one thing. It's going to be a lot of actions together. So I am a supporter of this medical movement. And in my job in MAPS, I am supportive of advancing clinical trials and advancing all the scientific research. I think that's important. And showing the therapeutic potentials and benefits has certainly been a huge way to advance the legitimacy of psychedelics. And that was the case with marijuana. So first helping show the medical potentials and then extending to other uses. So the medical piece is one piece, and then I think this cultural piece is another one. And again, I was recently on a debate in Intelligence Square. It was, should psychedelics be legalized or not? And on one side, it was Rick Dobling from MAPS and I, and on the other, the ex-president of the American Psychiatrist Association, and a man that was like a drug czar, from consultant to Bush, Obama, and Clinton. And this medical doctor, he kept on saying, there isn't evidence that these things help creativity. And people just say they got insights, they got better, but how can you prove that? How can you prove that really happened? There is no scientific research. There's not enough evidence. There's not enough data. How can I know that psychedelics help anybody be more creative? And I told him, did you try to Google it? Because it's kind of just like so ridiculous to want to think that only a scientific peer review article can prove anything. Like science is this and life is this. And so, this guy was constantly saying that there was not enough science, but he also kept on saying, well, but I'm not speaking just as an academic. I had a firsthand experience, and so I know what I'm talking about, and I had a good experience. So when the cameras were off, Rick had asked him, hey, how do you know that your experience, how was your experience? Can you tell us? And he said, oh yeah, it was very good and this and that. And then he said, well, how do you know that it was really good? Do you have a scientific paper to prove it? And that for me was that was a kind of juicy climax of the whole meeting. Because this claim that we need science to prove, it's also a bit ironic, because this idea of like clinical trials and placebo and double blind and all this gold standard science research, and you probably know this as a neuroscientist, this is like 30s and 40s, and it's geared towards new substances, like substances that we have no proof and that were emerging as new substances. So to try to apply the logic of this to substances that exist since immemorial times is really contradictory. Anyway, coming back to your question, I do think that if we keep on having conversations and having other perspectives that are beyond the medical, but they are just talking about, it's also not just how this heals us, but how this is part of our lives, our identities, our territories, our socialization, our spiritual path, our friendships, and have more and more spaces where these conversations can happen. I do think that it helps. We have the experience of an ex-DA agent who went to our conference, Psychedelic Liberty Summit, and he was completely fascinated, and he looked us up and he was in awe. He didn't know any of that. He didn't know any of these conversations. He was curious. He wanted to have readings and recommendations. And we also get, a lot of business people, because when we're talking about building bridges, we're also trying to educate these newcomers and the people that are, the new recent Michael Pollan arriving in the field kind of person. Michael Pollan's book and decided to get interest in this. And these people also look us up and we give them literature, and people enjoy reading and learning. And so, yes, it's a process. And a lot of topics that Chacruna has put on the forefront, they start to become multiplied. It's incredible. It's a great joy for us. For example, we created our conference, Queer in Psychedelics. The overlap, the dialogues between the universe of queer, the queer movement and the psychedelic movement. So it looks kind of obvious, right? But nobody had done it in those terms before. And so, how did these things relate historically? How can psychedelics help queer people? What are the specific needs of queer people for psychedelic therapies? Or what are the specific gifts that queer people can bring for healing with psychedelics? And how do queer indigenous cultures have related to queer issues? We created this conference. After this conference, we've seen emerging dozens of queer integration circles around the US and even abroad. We've seen this being put in a bunch of more mainstream media articles. Now when they had the World Psychedelics Day, they had a queer panel. We were invited to curate panels on queer issues in a few different conferences. And this has been happening with a lot of topics that Chacruna has brought to the forefront. So queer issues around commodification of psychedelics, issues around sexual abuse in ceremonies, issues around racial issues in psychedelics. We were talking about peyote conservation since 2016, and this is a big topic now that more and more people are talking. So yes, I think for sure promoting conversations and publications and knowledge is a good thing. But then again, I'm a kind of hippie. I'm an anthropologist, and my worldview is my worldview. It's not shared by everybody.